With us in the Smathers Library, or if you're online, I'm Judy Russell. I'm the Dean of University Libraries, and I'm very happy to have you with us this afternoon to learn more about our recently acquired Gore Vidal collection. And we have with us Steve Abbott and Jim Stevens, who are the donors of the collection. And Stephen is the official bibliographer of Gore Vidal, and there's a copy of the book here on the table. I'm sure we're going to be holding it up at some point. It's an impressive tome, should we say? Oh, there we go. I don't know if they can see it from there, maybe too close to the camera. But there is also an exhibit of some selected materials from the collection. So I hope that if you haven't already had a chance to look at it as you arrive, before you leave, you'll walk around and look at some of the things in the exhibit case, and they may be even more meaningful after you've heard some of the wonderful stories about how they developed this relationship with Gore that turned into this wonderful documentation of his work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Neil Weijer, who's the curator for the collection and who's going to moderate the conversation this afternoon. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everybody. And first of all, let me just say, that's okay. I don't think we need that part, right? Let me just say it's wonderful to have this collection, to be able to work with it, and to be able to, so often with the materials in our libraries, we don't get to talk to the people who put them together. And so I'm really looking forward to this. Stephen, you've been collecting this material since the 1970s, really, even a little bit before.
Late 60s, yeah. Close enough.
And Jim, you've come into this, you've jumped in with both feet and lived with the books and the collection for 30 years. So, I mean, maybe we could just get started. Could you tell us a little bit more about your relationship with Gore Vidal in person and then through his writing?
I was in a Boston gay study group, and there were half dozen of us, and each one of us rotating to choose an author that we were interested in. And I was interested in Gore. We read people like Ronald Furbank and Susan Sontag, Tennessee Williams, Edward Albee. And out of that group came a piece called Notes on Myra Breckinridge. One of the other gentlemen in the group, John Mitchell, was also a Gore enthusiast. And out of that came this piece, and we published a piece. Both John and I were on staff in a newspaper called Fag Rag. And the reason that we called it Fag Rag is because we wanted to take a word that had been used in a negative way and turn it around and say, we're proud to be fags. So that got published in the Notes on Myra Breckinridge, which you'll see in one of the, it's pink, so you can't miss it. So that got published, and Gore was on a book tour for Burr, which at the time was the best-selling book in the English language. And he came to Boston. He was staying at the Ritz-Carlton, and we went over and left a copy of it for him at his desk. So Sunday morning, November the 3rd, the phone rings. My partner answers the phone and says, it's Gore Vidal on the phone. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's Gore Vidal. And one of my friends, of course. Well, it was Gore. So he invited us to come and join him that afternoon, and I asked him if we could bring a tape recorder, and he said yes. And so we did a tape recording of Gore. And during the conversation and time I spent with him, I said, I'd like to spend as much time as I can with you while you're here in Boston. So I went the following morning to a television studio with him, and then I went to a book signing at the Harvard Cooperative Society. And then when the end of that day came, he was moving on. He was doing like a 40 city tour. I didn't have really anything to write on, so I took a piece out of my notebook, and Gore signed his address in Italy and basically said, stay in touch. And since then, I stayed in touch with him.
Yeah, and before you were in library school in Boston, right?
Mm-hmm.
You were, yeah. and you kind of were introduced to Vidal through his books in the library.
Yes, I worked, when I was in high school, I always tell people for the princely sum of $1 an hour, I worked as an assistant, basically shelving books. Well, the branch library I worked in were a lot of people who just loved to read. And Gore Vidal's books were always on a wait list. And I read Julian, which is still probably my favorite historical novel of his. It's one of those books that I read and I never wanted it to end. In fact, I really wanted him to go back to that. He sort of didn't, but he did when he did his study of comparative religions called Creation in the early 80s. And as we all know, he's famous in terms of writing what he called the American Chronicle series: Burr, Lincoln, 1876, Empire, Hollywood, Golden Age. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, we're just talking at this point. So this is no, and that was sort of the moment that you met. You said, well, you kept in touch. How did that develop into collecting? Collecting, I should say, for those of you who are just coming into this collection is over 1,500 books, plus manuscripts, typescripts, ephemera, programs.
Play scripts.
So to go from encountering somebody's book in the library to this, like, sort of, how did that progress along?
I always thought Gore Vidal would have made a great dean for a university, because I really appreciated his breadth of knowledge in history, in art, in politics, and as I became more and more interested also in the fact that the City and the Pillar had been was so controversial. It had been banned by the New York Times in a way in which it wasn't quite at the moment that the book was released, because it was a bestseller on their list, but afterwards, until Julian was published, they refused to review a book that had Gore Vidal's name on it. During that time, however, Gore, savvy he was, wrote some mysteries under the pseudonym of Edgar Box. He also wrote books under the name of Catherine Everard and under the name of Cameron Kay. Those were reviewed, some of them, by the New York Times. As I got to know Gore more and more, at that point there was already a bibliography of his, and it wasn't a full citation bibliography like mine is, but I just continued to collect his work, and as I began to travel, I also began to notice the difference in how books were marketed, in Holland versus France versus Thailand. And so I sort of got fascinated with that also. Anything else you can think of, Jim?
Well, I think that the idea of just gathering up a copy of every published variation of his book became an obsession in a very positive way. Yeah. And that really sort of was just an intellectual exercise in many respects. And then it just became a competition to some extent with his friend Harry Cloman. Now, Harry Cloman is the person who established the Gore Vidal Index. And he at that time taught at the University of Pittsburgh. And so Harry and Stephen had not ever met, but they became known to each other trying to bid against each other on eBay and every other available source for books. So they decided at one point to not bid against each other. What they would do is they would alternate who would put in the last bid on a book. And then the next book that came up that they were both interested in, the other one would get it. But in addition to the idea of collecting, there was also the idea of the search and competing to some extent, which made it more than just an intellectual exercise. It turned into a fun event because each book that you added to the collection was not just a personal achievement, but it was an achievement in this environment of collectors.
One of the book covers there is from his book as Catherine Everard. This is the rare British edition, and Harry couldn't get a copy of that book, so I made several copies like that, and I sent him to one that he could put over his book, you know, nudge, nudge. But Harry was really instrumental in this book being created in the almost complete form that it is, in the sense that Harry collected the foreign editions. And whenever I knew anyone who was traveling to South America or wherever it was, I would say, if you find anything that's a translation of Gore's, please bring it back. The other way in which this collection became expanded even beyond what Harry and I had is we went right after 9/11 and stayed with Gore for a week in Ravello, in his home in Salerno in Italy. And before we left, Gore gave me a copy of all of the foreign editions that were there. And the Italian system is very strict about how you post something. It has to be twined. It has to be a certain size. So Gore's partner Howard, sort of led us through that process. Well, we went down to the post office, which we had to actually go down the hill there wasn't a post office big enough in Ravello to do this. So we went down with 200 books boxed. And as soon as the postmistress saw that they were from Mr. Vidal, we were going to send them C-mail, of course. So she took the postage for C-mail, but they arrived by airmail before we got back to the States. So he was very well respected and thought of in Ravello and the environs.
Yeah, and there's a quote that I really like from an essay on book collecting and library building. It says, that the American public system, the institutional libraries, owe a lot to what they say the diligence, the expenditure, and the reckless zeal of private book collectors. But what they do is they kind of identify there's a point where, was there a point where you kind of realized, maybe in the course of the bibliography, that what you had thought was a comprehensive collection of maybe just his novels and his articles, that there was so much more beyond that?
That was actually before I started to write the bibliography, because what I wanted to do is I wanted ultimately to leave this collection. I thought I was going to leave it to like a gay studies program or a university that specialized in that. And so I wanted everything. And I met Andreas Brown, who was the proprietor of the Gotham Book Mart. And the Gotham Book Mart is in New York City, and it was the bookstore he was actually Gore's bookseller. He was also Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis's bookseller, Eugene O'Neill's, and on and on and on. I mean, it was that kind of environment. In fact, there's a postcard there somewhere that maybe has gone around that is a photograph of 18 or so authors done in like 1948. Yeah. There it is, at the Gotham Book Mart. But Andreas being Gore's bookseller, I asked him to show me what he had, and that's when I knew that I could really expand the collection, because of what Andreas had, and also because of Andreas's relationship with other people in the American Booksellers Association. So that. Yeah.
And he introduced you to some other collectors.
He did indeed, yeah.
Who were of a different ilk.
That's right. Yes.
They were not the ones who were digging around in the boxes in the basement of a bookstore in London trying to find copies. They were more curated through somebody else collecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that amazed me when this collection came here in 60 boxes and opening them, and taking, the selection of items that you see behind you is kind of representative of the different categories and types of material that you find here. When you say, I wanted to collect everything, you're talking about collecting everything from somebody who was consistently in print from 1946 until 2009, 2010. Mm-hmm. So that's not it's not a particularly easy thing to do. Mm-hmm. But maybe we can talk about specifically, because you were saying, your connection through the gay studies, the gay reading group. The two books that are kind of top of that list are The City and the Pillar in 1948, and then Myra Breckinridge. Could you just talk a little bit about what, reading those books as, as a teenager, I think you said,
I
in
was
Boston?
17 when I read Myra, and she spoke to me. What can I say? And I was also, because he had been so, I don't know what the right word is, but because what he was offering as a writer was so denigrated after The City and the Pillar and dismissed, I was so thrilled for him with the success of Julie and with Washington, D.C., and then with Myra Breckinridge. And Myra is one of those books that Gore called his inventions. And he could certainly write a historical novel, but Myra was so different than anything else he had ever written. Even Truman Capote, who was one of his nemesis, said, "Gore, I never thought you'd be able to do this." He was really surprised. So I went to Gore as kind of a professor. He talked in the book on the first page about a group of Trobriand islanders, and I thought, I've never heard of these people. So when I was reading Gore, I also had a dictionary or an encyclopedia with me, because that was the knowledge from which he wrote from. He literally had that there. And it was available. He literally wrote everything in longhand. When he wrote Myra Breckinridge, if you have a chance to look at the original script page, which we don't have, the library doesn't have the original copy of that. Harvard University is, but you have a copy of that page. And originally he wrote, "I am Myrna Breckinridge," and he crossed out the N, and later on, Myrna thanked him because she felt that she would have forever been known as Myrna Breckinridge.
And who was that person supposed to be in his life?
There was Myra. There was certainly Buck Lohner was based on the director John, who actually directed the movie. I think John. He has a daughter who's all Houston. Yes. The agent in the book, Letitia Val Allen, is based on his own Sue Menders, his literary agent. She was also Barbara Streisand's agent. So that's the kind of atmosphere that Sue worked in.
And for those of you who maybe are coming to these for the first time, what was so, you mentioned about Vidal's career after City and the Pillar. What was so descriptive? What jumped out at you when you were reading, books that talked about homosexual or transsexual relationships, ideas, attitudes for the first time kind of openly in print in America?
Yeah. I had hoped that other people would follow in his footsteps, and it's taken decades for that to happen, but it is happening.
Well, I think that the idea that Gore Vidal accepted all of the variations of human sexuality in a positive way, in the sense that in The City and the Pillar, sometimes you had to have a sad ending to anybody who was identified as non-normal, if you want to use that word. But, with Myra Breckinridge and a lot of his work, he expanded upon what was acceptable to write at the time he was writing.
And he did research, for example, in Lincoln, and opened up he opened up a huge conflagration almost with Lincoln historians, because he said that Abraham Lincoln had in fact slept with a man.
And of course, Sally Hemings was also, he was the first person to publicly embrace the reality of what actually happened with Sally Hemings. So it wasn't just in the novels like, Myra. It was in every novel where he sort of was trying to say this is what really happens in the world, and it needs to be recognized for that and not punished or treated as an aberration.
And he had the quote unquote evidence to back up what he was writing.
He was associated with Kinsey also.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that was.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was one of the people who was really outwardly, promoting, because the theories about human sexuality that were emerging in the late 40s and early to mid 50s.
And an interesting thing about Gore and sexuality is that he never allowed himself to be pigeonholed. He wouldn't be called gay. He looked at sexuality on that spectrum, but he refused. He said, whatever you do in the bedroom is an act. It doesn't define you as a person. There is no homosexual, there is no heterosexual. We're all on that wavelength or, whatever, wherever we end up.
Yeah, and I mean, he was also someone who had worked, he published his first book as a teenager, and worked in the publishing industry, worked in the film industry. It's really remarkable to see across all the different periods how those themes kind of work their way back into his writing. But he was always interested in that idea of individual expression. But one of the things that I noticed in the case, and I hope you guys get a chance to check this out, for those of you in the room, is in Myra Breckinridge, the book was not only sensational, it was censored in other English-speaking countries, in the UK and Australia. And the film adaptation, the X-rated film adaptation, was something that Vidal submitted a script for, but was ultimately not picked to write his own movie. How do you think, how do you see him, or how did you see him kind of trying to preserve the integrity of his own voice in those situations?
I think he gave up. I think he knew all of the peccadillos. He knew about the financing in Hollywood, and he did what he could. He chose projects that, like The Life of Billy the Kid, which he took from a novel through 4 different screenwriting scripts, and then that it was produced with his ideas.
I mean, one of the things that jumps out to me too is that there are pre-published materials in the collection, so proofs that are one step away from publication. And in the UK and the British version of Myra Breckinridge, the preface, which is out in that case, says this book has been modified to bring it in line with the censorship, the moral decency laws.
The exalted morals.
The exalted moral, yeah. And there's a line in the draft that says, and I'll quote it here, it says, despite her mutilation at the hands of unfeeling solicitors, the gallant Myra still lives, and it's initialed GV. It doesn't appear in the published version of the book, but you could kind of see him saying, as long as I can, I'm going to have this, I'm going to have my say.
Right.
And he could inhabit a character and a voice that was really,
Not only inhabit the character, he could actually he was amazing at mimicking, whether it was Eleanor Roosevelt or JFK. I mean, he had that ability. I don't know if any of you remember when he was on Laugh-In, and he was Gore Vidal, and Lily Tomlin was Ernestine the operator. And they went back and forth about him having overdue bills. So he was almost in those days a household word. You could not get away from Gore. And of course, there was such limited social media at that time that he was in actually most of our homes in one way or another.
I mean, one of the most prominent ways being the presidential debates, the commentary on the presidential debates with William Buckley. Was that something, how was your experiences of that, when you're reading him and you're interviewing him? Were politics separate for you?
Good question. No, they really weren't. And the night of the debate, which of course I watched, I was absolutely thrilled for him because I knew that what Gore was trying to do with Buckley is to get him to show his real feelings. and he was able to do that, or during that debate, with the Buckley's lashing out at him.
Well, yeah, he made it possible for Buckley to just explode and really get it all out in front. And I think that one of the important things about the way he treated people that he dealt with was he was always trying to get them to say what they honestly believed, not what they were sort of pre-recording. And, as Nancy Pelosi very famously said about certain members of the House, the best thing that could possibly happen is for them to speak truthfully about what they believe. Because at that point, you can get information and you can deal with that information. You can share what their true beliefs are, and you can work from that. Because if you're always dealing with a muddied presentation of fact compared to action, that's a little difficult to confront. So, but it's really interesting about him, and politics is, of course, his desire to maintain human dignity and individual rights was a real theme of his life. But at the same time, he became quite a commentator because he had walked the walk. I mean, he ran for the House in New York. He ran for the Senate in California. He, at that time, was well known to be living with Howard. He was living in a gay lifestyle during all of that period of time to everybody who knew anything about him, really. And at the same time, he wrote The Best Man. And of course, if you've read The Best Man or you've seen it, you know that the theme is part of homosexuality and whether or not a candidate would release that kind of information against an opponent to achieve something. But when you talk about him as a political figure, you have to really, I think a lot of people who interviewed him viewed him as somebody who had been through that and wasn't an outside observer, but rather a person who had been in the trenches. So when they spoke with authority. And that was a big advantage.
There's also, just remembering Dianne Feinstein. When Dianne Feinstein was running for Senate, the person that she was running against, there were rumors that he was gay. And they came to Dianne and they asked her, they wanted to release this. And Dianne said, absolutely not. So that's
and
remembering her.
And I think, there some of the political careers, you can see there are photos of, there's a really famous photo of Vidal and Tennessee Williams and John F. Kennedy hanging out in Florida together. This is someone who was intimately connected with his own lifestyle, his own sexuality, but then also the political elite of America. He was a senator's grandson.
And if you want to know what the revered Tennessee Williams had to say about John F. Kennedy, he said, "Oh, he has a very nice ass." So, in fact, Gore had sort of some highlights in his life, and certainly the Buckley Vidal debate was one of them. But there were a couple of others. One was when he was when he would have been an undergraduate at Harvard. He had gone to Exeter. He'd been in the war. He came back after the war. Many of his classmates from Exeter were at Harvard studying, and Gore went and gave them all a lecture. So we thought that was a high point.
Yeah, he elected not to go to.
Yeah, another high point of his was right after the presidential election, when JFK was elected. He accompanied JFK to his play The Best Man on Broadway, and that certainly amped up the interest and the box office on that.
And I think it's funny that somebody who is still a teenager, after publishing his first book, goes to goes to Harvard and says, "Okay, kids,
Right.
here, let me tell you how to write a novel."
That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
no, and I mean, I think it's that in some ways you can draw some consistent lines from that moment in the 60s when, Vidal becomes more, I mean, it's hard to say whether he becomes more politically active or oriented in his writing, or he just publishes more in pieces like Esquire and The Nation, New York Review of Books. But you can kind of look at that moment where he says to Buckley, no, people protesting the war in Vietnam in 1968, who have just been attacked by police officers in Chicago outside the convention, should be able to protest and even, raise the Viet Cong flag in Chicago. That is their right of expression. You can draw a line almost from that to what he'll later say about the Bush-Cheney government after in American foreign policy after 9/11. So there are some things that I think are really remarkably consistent.
They are.
But I mean, one of the things that he didn't really talk about, and you both were involved in community activities and then national activities after the AIDS outbreak, combating the spread of HIV. One of the things he never really talked about in a lot of his work publicly was AIDS and HIV. How did you mention that there are other people who were reading Vidal along with you in the 70s and then into the 80s? How did his perception change among those communities? Were people hoping that
I think people were hoping that he would make a statement, and he just refused to do it. He did make one statement in a magazine called Pause, which was a magazine that was created for people with HIV and their supporters and caregivers. And it was his nephew had AIDS. He was a painter, and Hugh Steers, and he had died. And Gore, in the very short 3-paragraph piece, Gore talked about how his nephew had considered suicide and decided no, he was going to actually work on his art. And over the next 10 years, he produced works that were valuable and artistic, and that Gore was very proud of him. But other than that, I was one of the founders of the San Francisco Stop AIDS Project, which was all about prevention. What we were trying to do is to get people, before they fell into the river where they became HIV infected, to do the work before that. And he knew I was a founder. He knew I was on the board. He knew my job as a board member was to raise money for the organization. But he never, I asked him, I sent him materials. The other thing that shocked Jim and I, we went, when we were staying with him in Italy, is that Rudolf Nureyev was a friend, and he showed us across from where he was in Positano, his island. And mentioned that Nureyev lived there, and also mentioned that that he had come for a final visit to say goodbye, and he had swum in their swimming pool, and that after he had left, Howard and Gore had the swimming pool drained, and I was just horrified. I couldn't believe it that someone with Gore's intellect would be so absent in terms of knowing what the facts were about how HIV was transmitted. And we were both.
Yeah. It was a disconnect, and it's just hard to explain how he could have felt that somehow he was protecting himself.
And at the same time that he wouldn't say anything about that, on his book tours, where most Random House wanted him to do all of the book chain stores, he insisted on doing the independent bookseller stores. And he also, on one of his trips when he came to San Francisco, he did a benefit, not really mentioning where the money was actually going, but it was at Metropolitan Community Church. And he did this benefit, spent hours there. And so on the one hand, you would get this Gore who wouldn't say anything at all, his sort of public self where he wouldn't say anything, but privately he wanted to do something to help, but not officially. So it's interesting to...
Well, I think the same ambivalence, if you want to call it, existed because he did which I think is a very valid way of looking at things. You know, sexual activity is on a continuum in the human race, and therefore being categorized as a certain, because you occupy a certain segment of this little continuation, is not your defining feature. That also was something that people were a little annoyed about, because they wanted him to be a spokesperson, because he was living a lifestyle which could only be considered to be a gay lifestyle. It isn't as though, I mean, everybody knew everything, so he would never come out. He would just acknowledge what everybody's saying using their terminology. But he refused to assume somebody else's terminology to define what he felt his particular situation in life was. And that could be viewed in many ways, one of which is some people in the gay community viewed that as a repudiation. But if you are, you know, it was totally consistent with the way he was viewing sexuality.
Yeah, and you said in that first reading group, when you guys were reading Myra together, it wasn't everybody was on board. There were some people who, didn't think that.
The Fag Rag was also a collective, and we made decisions together, and there were people who really thought that Gore was not gay enough. And ultimately, there was some pressure. There was a columnist, George Fraser, who wrote in the Boston Globe. He's sort of like Herb Cain, or I'm trying to think of some other novelist or columnist, maybe Fran Lebowitz, where if they could, so Fraser literally came out in the Boston Globe and said, this interview needs to be printed. And another thing that sort of added pressure to us to print them is that Jan Wenner from Rolling Stone got hint that Gore had given us this interview, so he offered to publish it in Rolling Stone. And we told him absolutely not. But then when we went back to the other group, they reluctantly agreed that Fag Rag should publish it and not Rolling Stone. So it was kind of a campaign, to get Fag Rag to actually publish it.
Yeah, and you conducted more interviews with him, obviously, even in the follow-up the year after that,
right.
For other literary works. What do you think? What do you think he wanted his defining characteristics to be? If how you mentioned that he cultivates this public persona, he gives hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews. What do you think he wanted to project?
He wanted to project, I think, control. He wanted to project that his was the only point of view, and if you argued with him, he once said, if only people would do, what I said, the world would be in much, much better shape, sort of. I think he wanted, to be known as a writer, and I think just very honestly, there are many people now who are critics who would say that Gore was a better essayist than he is a writer. And in some ways, in terms of the essays are brilliant. I can't think of too many other writers. I mean, he wrote for the New York Review of Books, and whenever a new issue would come out that had his name on it, I sit there and I would literally laugh out loud. I mean, the wit was there. I mean, especially if you kind of knew the references and you followed along with what was going on. I tend to agree that some of the novels are really good, but it's going to be very interesting to see what scholars hopefully at this university will write about Gore in terms of looking at the novels, looking at the American Chronicle series, looking at the essays, the plays, etc.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that jumped out, even looking at the inventory, which it's not very often that when somebody gives us a large collection, they give us a really well-organized spreadsheet, much less a published bibliography. So thank you very much. But looking at these, your decision to kind of chart editions and reissues, different types of publications, I mean, you can look across it and see how, not unlike earlier really prolific writers at periods, like the Victorians, and some of the writers who he emulated, whose styles he emulated, he would publicize chapters of his books in a magazine. He would reissue his essays in combined editions with, of his novels. So, when City and the Pillar is reissued after Myra Breckenridge, it comes out with his article Sex and the Law, which appeared in Esquire, I think it was. And so you can see somebody who is really not just a static figure even across their publishing career. It's not just, the novels and the essays, category. So, I mean, one of the things that you said was really striking the other day, because as a political figure, as a commentator, this was sort of an introduction to the Crossfire style commentary that we now all take for granted and wish, maybe would go away, or could at least be muted. But you said you didn't think it was possible for another public intellectual, a figure like Gore, to exist today. Could you maybe tell us a little bit why?
Because we're all watching whatever we're watching on our way too expensive gadgets here, and instead, I mean, when I went to school, one of the goals was, no matter how passionate you were about something, that you could also be, at least deliver the message that would have come from the other side. And I'm not sure that's happening now.
I think the basis of all of the popularity, or the fact that Gore Vidal was in everybody's home, was there were only 6 channels, 6 or 7 channels. So you turned on your television and you had a very small choice and they weren't segmented the way they are now. All of the channels had a breadth of points of view that they produced. And so you actually got to hear people you didn't even want to listen to. And, you'd sit there, you could mute it. But in those days, without a remote, you had to walk up and turn it down. I mean, So you actually heard a variety of people and a variety of ideas, and you could reject them, but you heard them. And you heard them in a way that they were considered to be valid. They were on a media platform that was basically you welcomed in your home, and you didn't believe, or usually you didn't believe, that it was attempting to sell a point of view at the expense of truth. And unfortunately, we're no longer in that environment. And so I'm sure there are many fine things that have occurred in the media world and the accessibility we have. But one of which is that people can maybe even inadvertently self-select, and they never get the ideas coming across from the other groups of people. So.
Yeah, and I mean, when I think about not just that, the work of selecting and appearing, and in some cases the media organizations and figures that were acting as moderators. You have, I think, a famous scene after the Buckley debate where Paul Newman, who's a friend of Vidal, goes up to Buckley and says, "You shouldn't have done that. That was too much, and you should know better." I don't, and some of that pops out through the collection, through the ways that these different journals and editorial boards are working with each other. So, I mean, I think it is something that we can, we try to keep in mind as much as possible. But I guess one thing that we get a chance to think about is, we've talked about free expression being kind of a common thread. Why do you think, what do you think we can learn about this need, this insistence that positions should be held, they should be argued, they should be debated publicly? What do we learn from Vidal's writings over the course of his life about that?
Well, again, his overarching goal was to warn people that their individual liberties and rights were under attack by many different groups. And, he was very much against the TSA, the airplane, checking for people carrying something on an airplane, because his position was that the probability of something happening was so minimal. But what you have subjected yourself to is a process where all of a sudden you're releasing yourself. You are releasing your ability to go certain places, and you're going through a governmental sponsored process to arrive at the other side. Now, we can, I'm not arguing that it would be a good idea to get rid of the TSA, because I probably think it isn't. But the idea that it was, really at that point, one of the few places where the average person was actually going through this kind of a governmental process to get from one location to another. And that was the issue. It wasn't that. It was, at what point do you allow the government to go in a space where, in order to go in the most harmless way from one point to another, you can't do that without going through this kind of a situation. And, so he talked about it in a way people could understand, using TSA as an example. But more so, it was just surveillance, and it was thought police, and it was a lot of other things. And I think he realized, of course, that he could never achieve the goal of eliminating this kind of intrusion. But at the same time, he wanted to make people aware of it, and also to encourage them to limit it in a way that made the most sense. And so that's the whole theme of everything that he did was around, in my opinion, around that kind of an approach to what is democracy in the United States, what's governance, what's acceptable conduct on the part of the government, and how does it infringe on individual people. And it seems to me like basically those principles can be agreed upon across the board. That's not a Republican or Democratic position necessarily. It's, it is a fundamental human rights position.
Yeah, and I mean the TSA, because you guys were basically, you kind of experienced some of this with him as, more so than TSA, is the Patriot Acts. And I think that's really what animated the last part of his essays and writings. So, what was it like kind of seeing that unfold really in real time for both of you?
When I read the Timothy McVeigh essay, I thought he's gone too far, because the American public was not going to buy this. Certainly the television stations where he had his largest platform were going to blackball him, and they did. And
could you let some of the group know what was Vidal?
We were in Ravello right after 9/11. We were on some of the first flights that left the country. We flew separately. I don't remember. I think I had to go to London or something before I came. And in any case, Gore was very sad of what was going on. In fact, when we were there, the bombing began in Iraq. And one night, Gore started reading after dinner this essay of his, which became Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace. And he began to read it, and he handed it to me, and I continued to read it, and I handed it to Jim. And we had a friend of ours, Rob Bregoff, who was staying not with us with Gore and Howard at Ravello. He was staying at the local hotel there. And Gore, at the end of all of this, said, "Well, I'm so glad that somebody got to hear this piece," because he was convinced what had happened was that Vanity Fair who originally had written the article for them, they paid him a kill fee, and he asked why, and they said because they thought that Cheney would just shut them down. And then he went to The Nation magazine, where he was on board and a regular contributor, and they for the same reason refused to publish it. The icing on the cake that came all out of this, or the pony in the pile of Maynard, was that his Italian publisher, Fazzi Press, published it. And suddenly it became a bestseller in Italy. So it got picked up in Germany and in Denmark and et cetera. And finally, guess who? The Nation Books in New York published the US edition, and it became really one of his last best-selling books.
That was
And that was-
Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace. That was the name of the book.
Yeah.
Which,
It's called Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace.
And
that's a circuitous route, and that dealt with the shutdown of the ability to print in the U.S. under government control because they wanted to keep a dialogue only using the language that they were using. But eventually it was published here. But, you know, the idea that this was happening without people realizing it was something that he was so concerned with. And, you know, he had an audience that felt or the same way he did. But there was a huge audience out there that he was trying to reach, to say that you must be incredibly careful about how your rights as a U.S. citizen. He was very proud of the United States. In fact, he thought it was the best country in the world, but he wanted to protect that area, you know.
Yeah, and he wanted, I mean, especially in his political novels, you see him saying, well, the imperial aspirations
Right.
of any country, but especially, you know, America after, you know, in the 1980s onward, you know, after the Vietnam War, were increasingly sort of subjects of criticism. And in some ways, you said people look at the things that he published about McVeigh and about the, you know, the Patriot Act, about the ways that these dialogues were happening in America in the 1990s, and he seems incredibly, you know, he seems incredibly forward-looking for us in our current moment. But I mean, it's hard to imagine, again, like somebody who has been, as you guys get the chance to look, you know, pervasive across every major media form, but also in 2001, somebody who was a veteran of the Second World War and whose conception of America was based in that. You know, a smaller and smaller group of people, myself included, were you know, available to receive that message. But I think what would be great is if we could get some questions from our audience. But first, I would love to thank you both, not only for your time and for your incredible, you know, recollections of this, but for giving us this collection, and also to Harry for, you know, supplementing some of the foreign editions, because I mean, what we have here really is, in its form and in its location, it's unlike anything that anybody else has put together. So thank you so much. You're welcome. Yes.
Well, if it's on that, and say the other thing is I know, but how did you choose the University of Florida?
One of my best friends that when I was on the board of the Stop AIDS Project, we went to board fairs for people who wanted to be were interested in coming onto boards, and groups of 501c3 nonprofit organizations would sit at tables, and we were looking for someone who had, at that point, who had finance ability, and a gentleman who just gotten out of graduate school, Christopher Cowan, came and was interviewed by us, and we brought him onto the board. And Chris is a long-term friend of mine, and Chris came to work at this university a few years ago, and he's our executor, and so he knew that we were looking for a home for this collection. He also knew that I had a relationship with Stanford because I organized the papers from the Stop AIDS Project to go to Stanford, and you know, he thought, well, the collection will go to Stanford, and I told him no, because Gore left his papers to Harvard University. So Stanford didn't want So Chris introduced us to your lovely dean here, and I'm not sure what your title was at the time, Haven, but in any case, we fell in love with them, And we met over the phone, and they came to San Francisco. They were willing to go to our storage unit to look at the collection, which we, of course, boxed up as much as we could, put in a car, and took back to their hotel so they could be comfortable while they went through it. But that's how the collection.
So it was based on personal contact with people that we felt so comfortable with, and so meeting those two was truly a delight, and that sealed the deal. The minute we got to know them a little bit.
First of all, thank you for today and for the collection. I'm a member of the library board, so we really, really appreciate it. But I did want to ask you a question. I had the privilege of seeing a revival of The Best Man with James Earl Jones, where I learned that bourbon and branch means water. That was a revelation to me. But I think it's very relevant today, because not only is it about the fear of retribution for being gay, it's also about dirty politics. And so I really commend people to reread it or rewatch it, because and I wondered if you feel the same way about it.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely, absolutely.
We Stephen and I talked about Vidal as a futurist anytime.
Yeah.
And the idea that so many things that he brought up and that he sort of outlined as dangers to our society, they actually seem to come true. And it's interesting to see how many references you see sometimes in reviews of what's happening now, where they bring up something that Vidal had written or some incident involving him.
Yeah.
But, you know, there are so many things, and this whole idea of politics deteriorating and all this stuff, that was a big theme of his, his writing. So I agree with you. I agree you can reread a lot of things that he's written and see how relevant they are today.
There's a program here, a playbill. The New York theaters, yes. The New York theaters did a celebration of Gore's life, and this is the program from that celebration. You can feel free to take it out, because there's something on the inside of it too. It doesn't need to stay in that. If you want to look at what's on the inside, feel free.
Yeah, this was great. I'm so glad I heard about this. Thank you, UF, for putting it on. Gore Vidal was a big part of my life, I guess, all the way through, from seeing him on Merv Griffin's show or the 1968 convention coverage and things like that. And right, he was everywhere, but this peripheral figure. What you were just saying actually makes me think, I think I have a copy of Myra Breckenridge around, and I think I should reread it, because when I read it, I know a lot of it probably went right by. So, but what I want to ask about is one of his later things he did in life, and that was the movie Bob Roberts.
Yes.
With Tim Robbins' movie, political satire, and he plays Brinsley Pace, a stodgy senator on his way out. What was his involvement with that film? Did he contribute much, or was he just kind of a hired gun?
He was a friend of Susan Sarandon's, and the family came to stay with them at Ravello. He was sort of like a gunkle to their kids. There was a chance for a camera to go up in front of him. Gore was like, "Oh yeah, I'm there." So he loved to be on camera. So he's in a film called Gattaca. He's in Igby Goes Down, uncredited, one of his nephew's films. So he's.
And they're here.
Yeah, right. They are.
They are.
Right, they are here.
I saw the playbill for the 2013 version of The Best Man. I opened it and I was like, oh, there's James Earl Jones and Angela Lansbury. That's crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah.
There are, the films have all been a part of the collection. So.
And interviews, televised interviews if they can be.
Thank you. You just mentioned the movie Gattaca. That was a movie I enjoyed a great deal. Do you have any anecdotes about it, or how Gore Vidal felt about being a movie star?
He wanted to be a movie star. He was particularly interested in doing a film with Lon McAllister, who was one of his boyhood idols. That never came to pass. But I think for Gore, being in the background, I mean, he was a script doctor. He worked with Bette Davis on Catered Affair. I mean, he worked on Ben-Hur. There was a lawsuit because actually William, I think it was whoever the original producer was, died while the filming was actually happening. But he had asked Gore to come on and script, and there's a very funny story about this. They told Stephen Bond, who was Masala in the film, to look like he was in love with Ben-Hur, who was played by Charlton Heston. And Gore said Chuck, he said, had no idea, what was actually going on there. But there he is. Yes. So in any case, so that was he never got to be the movie star, but he did get to be a political star and a television star. Yes. It was a great movie, actually. Yeah. You're so welcome. Thank you.
Hello, thank you again for this wonderful conversation. I have a question that I'm not sure you're going to have an answer to, but I'm curious. You mentioned that, Gore often felt like he was right. Did he ever come and say, I was really wrong about this thing? And was there anything that he had looked back on and said, I was wrong?
He was upset because a bookstore in England called Gaze the Way I can't remember the name of the street, but in any case, in Bloomsbury, and they'd been a gay bookstore. Just a little background on Gaze the Way. When the miners were striking in London during the Thatcher era, which was a pretty horrible time, some people at Gaze the Way decided to raise money for the miners. Well, at first, the miners didn't want any of the money at all. Well, that's the bookshop that came out of. So anyway, Gore had mentioned that Sexually Speaking, which Cleus Press had published, was being distributed over there, and he had a British publisher. And he was upset with Don Weijer, who was one of the people at Cleus Press in San Francisco. So I reminded him that we had been at lunch together, at my own peril. I reminded him that we had been at lunch together when he authorized Don to send copies from Cleus Press to that university. People often asked me, how did you stay in touch with him for decades? I mean, how did you do it? Well, I wasn't in the inner circle, so I was on the periphery, and he knew I absolutely loved his work and him. So I kind of, was careful. We were in Ravello, and Gore had his foreign editions upstairs in a separate room. He had various rooms in the house. One was named for Princess Margaret. We stayed in the Bill Styron suite because that's Bill Styron and his wife had come and had their honeymoon at that house. So we didn't qualify for the Princess Margaret suite. We were devastated. So cool.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Well,
You can tell us.
I'm not sure where you're going with it.
Oh, okay. I'm going to. So anyway, we went upstairs to that library and discovered there was mold on the books, and we were so lucky because we caught it early on. So I went down to his study and I carried a couple of the books with me, and I said, "Do not kill the messenger." However. And so part of what we did, we were actually working while we were there, going through his papers and his libraries. And so one of the things that we did is we ended up putting the books. I did some research immediately on mold on books, and then laid some of them out that were more rare editions in the sun and worked on, because it was hot sun when we were there, and had to discard a number of them. We were, people were intimidated by Gore. And he liked that.
Well, I think it's difficult to say that he said he was wrong, but he did say, you know, that he had unexpected consequences to what he did. And that's kind of a way of saying you might be wrong without saying you're wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. He would say something like, well, I didn't anticipate that,
Yeah.
or, you know.
So that made it easy to say.
And on that note, you learned a good deal about the publishing industry, right? When you were able to do the research for the bibliography, including the rock star treatment of writers. Do you want to share that with the group?
Oh,
Yeah.
you mean the Connaught incident?
Yeah.
We went through everything that we could find, and in London, his papers were outside of London in a warehouse, and so we went out there, and there was a lovely, lovely woman who I acknowledged her in the bibliography, and she made sure that we got whatever we wanted. Well, one day we read this correspondence from the finance department at his publisher to his agent, saying we've got to do something about this. He and Howard had run up a huge bill when they stayed at the Connaught, and the publishing house did not want to be responsible for that.
Well, our visit to the Connaught, he was being interviewed by BBC, and so Stephen had called him, and he said, "Come on over." So we get over to the Connaught, and if you're not familiar with that hotel, that is one of the most discreet and expensive hotels in London. So our first adventure was finding where
is the Connaught?
So we finally found out from the doorman of the hotel that was a little far away where it was.
From the doorman at the Dorchester.
So anyway, so we get there, and of course, here we are, and
Yeah,
we go in.
Jet lagging.
We tell them that we are here to see Mr. Vidal, and so all of a sudden they were lovely, and they offered us tea and all the rest of it. So then Gore came down, and he said, "Come on up." So we go up, and we go into this room that was big, but that was the living room. And then there was the bedroom, and then there was
Another bedroom, one for
another
each of them.
bedroom. And the thing, I mean, it was a palatial, absolutely palatial place to stay in the most expensive hotel in London. And so we leave, we're very impressed. And that's the follow-up to this was when Stephen found the letter a couple of years later about these tours have got to stop.
It's amazing what you can learn about the publishing industry by seeing what writers are doing. Yeah.
Well, one other thing is that Gore, in terms of the publishing industry, he worked at Dutton for several years, so he really got to know how the industry worked and how copyright worked. So you'll notice that why did he bring out this other edition, and why did he add a new preface or a new epilogue? Because he owned the copyright for another 27 years or whatever. I'm not sure what the current copyright law is, but he was really, really savvy about that and about how to market a book. I mean, I think in some ways Gore taught Jacqueline Suzanne everything that she knew about how to market, Valley of the Dolls and Love Machine and all of that, because they were the next people who did that kind of amped up national tour. When Myra came out, there was a statue of Myra that went along on this whole tour across the country. And and the same thing that they were even savvier though. The Suzannes actually went and bought food for the guys who were loading the trucks. I mean, they did the whole thing from the publisher all the way through to the bookstores. And she did amazingly well. I mean, she taught that sort of how you market a book. I'm currently working on Michael Cunningham's bibliography, and he has a new book coming out on the 14th of next month. So I'm watching to see how it's published by Random House, who was Gore's publisher. I'm very curious to see what the rollout of this is going to be. Very, very different than anything I've experienced before, I suspect. So
Okay, one more question over there. And then, I mean, one of my favorite items that I saw in terms of marketing, in the case over there, there's an Edward Box novel that has a blurb on it praising the book. The blurb is written by Gore Vidal. So he will put his name on twice on the same book.
Yes, right,
yeah.
he will, yeah.
Maybe along the same line as that, early in your discussion, you had mentioned how unique his writing was, and kind of hinted at wondering or waiting if someone could follow his lead. Have you seen any other authors that have been similar in what he did?
I've been looking for that. I mean, like if you take Myra Breckinridge, there were the Buckalona reports in it of different typeface. You know, when he did Two Sisters, which came not too long after, so actually it was the book after Myra, you can see that he was playing with text and having paragraphs in with play, with something that would be in a play. And I just don't see that kind of playing around, you know, with text and with the genre going on. Now, other people in this room, you know, may have a different sense of who's writing now and you know. One other thing that I wanted to leave with you all that I'm not going to answer the question for you on. There's a British paperback of his of Palimpsest, which is one of his memoirs, and there is a writer who wrote a quote on the book, and it's on the first edition, which this library has, that Gore demanded that it be removed from subsequent editions. So you have a little piece of, you know, ephemera here that you can go check out in the collection. No, absolutely not. I mean, you know, we have a room full of scholars here. Come on.
Yeah, we have a question from the front of the room, I think.
We've been talking about the bibliography, and I have it sitting here on my lap. And I think it needs to go up on the stage because I'm not sure people envision what a tome it is and what an amount of work it is. I mean, we've heard about how many years, how many years he published.
And not only that, that's
Exactly.
Which is also part of the collection. Not that one, but
No,
there's one in the collection.
But we still
also
need.
at the back of this book is about the same amount of material as probably half of it on a disc. So we just couldn't. I wanted it like, you know, like Auntie Mame says, like Proust, you know, in several volumes. You know, in any case, yeah.
But
So
I was afraid you might not have an impression of exactly how much 30 years of work turned into when you turn it into a book. It's a very substantial research volume and of great value. And
I'm working out
understanding.
now, so.
There we go.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, one of the things that's really fascinating is thinking about someone whose publishing career spans, you know, the typewriter era all the way to the digital age,
Yeah.
born digital material. So it will be hard to make a work like this for other authors, either prior or post. But you really needed to grapple with what all of those reviews and publications meant in the CD, you know, to make a book, not a book.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the group? Otherwise, we can kind of break down. We'll thank our speakers once again for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
And a wonderful start to the conversation. You know, this is the first time these materials have been out on display here at the University of Florida. It certainly will not be the last, and I think there are lots of collections here in the libraries, lots of communities in the libraries that will really welcome them. So please look around at the material, find a favorite thing, come and ask me about it, and enjoy some food.
And we too, Neil, want to thank you for this presentation.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much.
We walked in here yesterday and were just blown away. So thank you very much. Oh yeah, just a moment. This is at one point Gore was doing a seminar with Larry Kramer at Yale University, and they asked me if I could do something, you know, sort of showing the breadth of Gore's work, and I chose The City and the Pillar, And what I did is I sent them, and this was up sort of like a display like this at the university. And what they did is this is a display of all of the covers that I could find in all of the various editions. This is an early 50s edition here, if you like those pulp. And I'll just leave it out, and people can feel free to look at it at their leisure.
And there's a selection of those covers on the inside of your brochure, as well as in the cases over there. So you can see some of them in the pulp.
Okay.
All right. Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Yeah.